The processes of evolution. Evolution is the process by which modern organisms have descended from ancient ancestors, what we call descent with modification, which indicates a change in heritable information or gene frequency which pass from generation to generation within a population. So, evolution is responsible for both remarkable similarities we see across all life and the amazing differences of that life over time. There are four mechanisms of evolutionary change that can determine gene frequency. These include gene mutation, migration, genetic drift, and natural selection. Natural selection is a key mechanism of evolution or the driving force in addition to genetics and behavior. Natural selection is the theory that explains the origin of a species in terms of survival of those best adapted to a specific environment. There are three different types of natural selection based on their influence on a population. These are directional selection, stabilizing selection, and disruptive selection. Directional selection. Directional selection is a type of natural selection that operates in favor of one of the either extreme traits and against the mean or average and the other extreme traits from a range of traits within a population. For example, let us see phalanges of foxes in different environments. Thick fur or long hair in foxes is advantageous in cold climates, whereas thin fur and shorter fur in foxes is advantageous in hot climates. If the environment changed to colder climate, a group of foxes to establish themselves in favor of the colder environment. That means they need to become thick-furred. Over time, selection operates against the disadvantaged extreme, that is, medium and short furs, and in favor of the other extreme traits, long and thick fur, which means the mean and range of values or the medium length and above fur length and thickness shifts towards the favored extreme or long fur. So the frequency of the alleles causing longer fur will increase within the population. The question is, where have this gene come from? No doubt that this gene must be result of either new mutations or new combinations of alleles. Stabilizing selection is a type of natural selection that operates in favor of the mean or medium traits and select against both extreme traits from the range of traits. In a stable environment, individuals at both ends of the range of values or traits are the least well adapted. Selection often operates against both these extremes to reduce variability in the population and to make population more uniformly adapted. For example, birth mass in human babies. Babies who are very heavy or very light show a higher neonatal mortality rate or die more frequently at birth or just after birth than those of the medium mass. Here, the babies who are with medium body mass or the mean trait show less neonatal deaths, which is in favor with the environment. Over time, selection is operating to reduce numbers of heavy and light babies that are being born and increase the probability of median body mass, or the mean traits. Disruptive selection is a type of natural selection that operates in favor of both extremes of traits and select against the mean or median traits from the range of traits within the population. In this instance, individuals at both extremes of a range have some advantage over those displaying the mean or median values in the population in that environment. As a result of natural selection or environmental factors, the frequency of those individuals which have extreme traits in that environment increase, whereas the frequency of individuals which have middle or medium traits in that environment within the population will decrease. For example, the evolution of Darwin's finches in environment where there is insect deep inside the cracks of wood or tree trunks or ground cracks or hole and large and hard seeds. Environmental factors in this environment is food or feed. The feed include insects within the cracks and large and hard seeds. In this environment, finches with shorter and more powerful beak increase since they are able to feed on large and hard seeds. And in this environment again, finches with longer beaks can flourish since they feed on insects that are deep inside the cracks of barks and ground. But finches with an average length beak may not be able to obtain insects out of cracks in the bark of trees or ground as like as finches that have longer beaks, and they may not be able to crush seeds as like as finches which have a shorter and more powerful beaks. So the frequency of finches that have average length beaks will decrease and eventually disappears in this environment. Speciation and natural selection. What is speciation? Speciation is how a new kind of plant or animal species is created. Speciation mostly occurs when a group of population within a species are separated from other members of its species and develops its own unique characteristics. So, speciation is the evolutionary process in which populations of the same species evolve to become distinct species. There are four geographical modes of speciation in nature based on the extent to which speciating populations are isolated from one another through allopatric, peripatric, parapatric, and sympatric mechanisms. Speciation may also be induced artificially through animal husbandry, agriculture, or laboratory experiments. How can natural selection lead to the formation of new species? For this reason, natural selection provides a mechanism in which new populations of a species can arise and produce distinct species. Through this process of natural selection, favorable traits are transmitted through generations. Natural selection can lead to speciation, where one species gives rise to a new and distinctly different species. But at what point can these populations be considered as distinct species? If two populations of the same species become so different that individuals from these different populations cannot interbreed to produce fertile offspring, then when this happens, we must think of them as different or distinct species. I think first we need to define what is a species. A species means a group of similar individuals with a similar biochemistry, physiology, evolutionary history that can interbreed with each other to produce fertile offspring. There are a number of ways of speciation, but in this lesson, we are going to study the two main ways of speciation, allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. Different populations of the same species are unlikely to evolve into distinct species if they are able to interbreed, but they can only evolve to distinct species when they are somehow prevented from interbreeding. Speciation that involves isolation mechanism to prevent different populations from interbreeding for a period of time are allopatric and sympatric speciation. During this period, mutations that arise in one population cannot be passed to the other. Different selection pressures in different environments act on them, and the genetic differences between the two populations become increased. Eventually, the two populations will become so different that unable to interpret, reproductively isolated, and effectively they will become distinct or different independent species. Allopatric speciation. Allopatric speciation occurs when populations from an existing species geographically isolated and the isolated populations eventually develops into a new species. In allopatric speciation, the populations become isolated by some physical barriers that include rivers, mountain range, and landmass between water bodies. In this case, interbreeding between the populations become impossible, and lastly, speciation could be the result. For example, the shrimp populations of the Caribbean Sea and the Northern Pacific Ocean, which were once joined about 3 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama was formed and separated Caribbean Sea with North Pacific Ocean. So the Isthmus of Panama created two populations of shrimps, one on the Caribbean Sea and the other on the Northern Pacific Ocean. The shrimps from either sides of the isthmus still look remarkably similar, but they do not interbreed with each other. This tells us that the two populations of shrimps lastly evolved to distinct or different species. Sympatric speciation occurs when populations from an existing species develops into a new species without becoming geographically isolated from other members of the original species. So, the diverging populations may inhabit the same area but simply prevented from breeding in a number of ways, including seasonal isolation. In this mechanism, the different populations of a species reproduce at different times of the year. For example, palm trees growing on Lord Howe Island off the east coast of Australia. The second isolation mechanism is temporal isolation. In this time, different populations of a species reproduce at different times of the day. That means temporal isolation is one of the several types of reproductive barriers which can act to keep different or distinct populations of a species from interbreeding due to differences in timing, even if those individuals may occupy the same geographical area. For example, Malaysian orchid and cicadas. The third way that prevents interbreeding is behavioral isolation. This behavioral isolation is a mechanism in which different populations of a species have different courtship patterns or mating rituals. That means behavioral isolation prevents members of a population or a species from mating or interbreeding. For example, meadowlark birds, the western meadowlark birds and the eastern meadowlark birds. Generally, seasonal isolation, temporal isolation, and behavioral isolations are some of from many processes that lead to speciation. Through this process, members of a population diverge over time. This continues until they can no longer mate. They then eventually become separate species. Importance of polyploidy in plant evolution. First, we need to define what is polyploidy. Polyploidy is a type of chromosomal mutation in which cells and organisms contain more than two sets of chromosomes due to abnormal cell division. So, polyploidy cells have many sets of chromosomes per cell, sometimes four sets, eight, or more. Polyploidy has been important in plant evolution because it has allowed otherwise infertile plant hybrids to become fertile again. When different species form hybrids, very often the hybrid plants cannot produce offspring. This is because all the chromosomes cannot form bivalent or homologous pairs in meiosis. In this case, the plants cannot form sex cells and lastly or eventually become infertile reproductively. If the chromosome number were to double, then all chromosomes are able to form homologous pairs. In this case, meiosis and sex cell formation can take place and the hybrid is now become fertile again. So, hybridization and polyploidy have both been important in the evolution of modern wheat from wild grasses. Let us see from the diagram how modern wheat or Triticum vulgare evolved from wild grasses. As we can see from the diagram, the two wild grasses, Triticum monococcum with chromosome number 14 and Aegilops spiltoides with chromosome number 14 hybridize and produce fertile hybrid A that has 14 chromosomes. When chromosomes of fertile hybrid A doubles, it is changed to Triticum durum with chromosome number 28. When Triticum durum hybridizes with Aegilops squarosa with chromosome number 14, infertile hybrid B is produced that has 21 chromosomes. When the chromosomes of infertile hybrid B is doubled, it produces Triticum vulgare that has 42 chromosomes. You see, when the infertile hybrid B that has odd number chromosomes, which is 21, is doubled, it produces Triticum vulgare or modern wheat. This mechanism makes infertile hybrid to become fertile again. So, hybridization and polyploidy have played a significant role in plant evolution. So, polyploidy is very important in restoring fertility and it often results in bigger plants with more yields and big seeds. Divergent and convergent evolution. What is divergent evolution? Divergent evolution is the process whereby groups from the same common ancestor or species evolve and accumulate differences, which results in the formation of new species. This is due to different selection pressures in different environments. That means divergent evolution may occur as a response to changes in abiotic factors such as change in environmental conditions or when a new niche become available. Alternatively, divergent evolution may take place in response to changes in biotic factors such as increased or decreased pressure from competition or predation. As selective pressures are placed upon organisms, they must develop adaptive traits in order to survive and maintain their reproductive fitness. Differences may be minor, such as the change in shape, size, or function of only one structure, or they may be resulting in a completely different body structure or phenotype. So, divergent evolution leads to speciation and works on the basis that there is a variation within the gene pool of a population. If a reproductive barrier separates two or more groups within a population or a species, different genes controlling for various aspects of an organism's ability to survive and reproduce increase or decrease in frequency as gene flow is restricted. In this speciation process, allopatric speciation and peripatric speciation occurs when the reproductive barrier is caused by a physical or geographical barrier, such as river basin or mountain range. Alternatively, sympatric speciation and parapatric speciation take place within the same geographic area. For example, pentadactyl limbs of mammals and finches on the Galapagos Islands happen due to divergent evolution. When we see pentadactyl limbs of mammals through divergent evolution, organisms may develop homologous structures. These are anatomically similar structures which are present in the common ancestor and persist within the divergent organisms, although these structures have different functions. Similar anatomical setups of pentadactyl limbs of different mammals indicated that these different species of mammals evolved from one common ancestor through divergent evolution. You can see the image that shows an example of the homologous bones found in the forelimbs of four different types of mammals, that is, human, dog, bird, and whales. Another example of divergent evolution is Darwin's finches. One of the most famous examples of divergent evolution was observed by Charles Darwin and documented in his book on the origin of species. Upon visiting the Galapagos Islands, Darwin noted that each of the islands had a resident population of finches belonging to the same taxonomic family. However, the bird populations on each island differed from those on nearby islands in the shape and size of their beaks. Darwin suggested that each of the bird species had originally belonged to a single common ancestor or a single species which had undergone modifications of its features based on the type of food source available on each island. For example, the birds that feed on seeds and nuts evolved large crushing beaks, while cactus eaters developed long beaks and finer beaks evolved in birds that feed by picking insects out of trees. Convergent evolution is the process in which unrelated organisms evolve similar structures that are adapted for the same function. This can happen when different organisms occupy similar niches. When selection pressures or environmental factors on the populations are the same, similar adaptations can evolve over time. That means convergent evolution creates analogous structures that have similar form or function but were not present in the last common ancestor of those groups. The first example for convergent evolution is the giant armadillo giant pangolin, giant anteater, and spiny anteater. Giant armadillo live in North America, giant pangolin in Africa, giant anteater in South America, and spiny anteater in Oceania. They are not related evolutionarily, but all feed on ants and must obtain the ants from narrow cracks in the ground. You see, these four different species face or occupy similar niches due to these similar environmental pressures or similar environmental factors. Similar structures appearing in these unrelated organisms. These similar structures they have developed due to similar environmental factors or selection pressure is their mouth parts. Their mouth part is simply pointed. The second example is the wings of bird, bat, and the extinct pterodactyl. The wings of the four groups of organisms are morphologically and developmentally very different, but functionally they are similar. The organisms used these wings for flying. This indicated that these four different organisms evolved from different ancestry, but they gradually evolved to similar or they gradually converge due to similar environmental factors or the same selection pressures.